right, there we are. Good afternoon to all. Welcome to session 3 of our second year of the Maximos Seminar. We are still with the Ambigua, volume 1 of the Ambigua. We're looking at Ambigua 6 and 7 today. It's a handful, it's a whole thing. But we'll also look at the prologue as well. And just one second. I want to say two things to begin with. First is a phrase of St. Gregory's, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, who is the father of the church, the theologian, the prelate of the church, who Maximus is examining, who is an authority equal to the scriptures, perhaps, for them. He says, for everything is of God. For everything is of God. Everything is of God. That word "of" we've been circling around a few times lately. For everything is of God. But then in terms of sorting out the overall theme or trajectory of these three short pieces, the prologue, Ambiguum 6 and Ambiguum 7, we could speak of three forms of integrity. The prologue speaks to the integrity of the presence of the light of Christ, the integrity of the presence of the light of Christ. Ambiguum 6 speaks to the integrity of the person of Christ. And Ambiguum 7, which is arduous, the integrity of the light of Christ. So the presence of the light of Christ, the integrity of the person of Christ, and the integrity of the light itself of Christ. So turn to, the prologue begins on page 63. I just want to walk through a couple of elements here. First of all, Maximus opens it up with a kind of meditation or dwelling with the idea of learning and friendship and what's involved in that. He casts learning in the sense of asking a question or opening up horizons, asking questions of a teacher or a friend, right? It's an intimate movement immediately. And friendship here between John and Maximus, friendship becomes the oil of gladness, which renders dialogue gentle and supple. So we have learning, which has to do with companionship and opening up questions. And we have friendship, which is the oil of gladness, which eases those questions. And then Maximus brings it to a point near the bottom of 63. No need to turn, but near the bottom of 63, Maximus reiterates the needed receptive cast of mind, the receptive cast of mind that's needed for these kinds of thoughts. So he speaks to John saying, you have acquired a state of mind receptive to the mystical knowledge of God, receptive to the mystical knowledge of God, to the mystery with which we shall dwell, the mystical knowledge of God, the mystery with which we shall dwell. But being receptive or open to this truth, to this mystery, involves labor. And so on the next page, on 65, Maximus talks about the labor of spiritual work. And it reminds me of the holy injunction in the book of Deuteronomy, that spiritual work is to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. That is not easy. That is work. That is labor. That is the state of reception, loving reception to which we are aspiring. Now, also in this prologue, Maximus reemphasizes tonality. And tonality here is like an overall bent, an overall inclination, the sense of the whole, the directedness and the sense of the whole. Here again, he focuses on humility and reverence. That's on 60, 65 and 67. Humility and reverence. In other words, to be humble or to be reverent is the appropriate form which divine human relations take. It's a relation of humility and of reverence on our part. Maximus also talks in this prologue about his method. He says that what they were seeking to do was to concentrate on the inner meanings of what our holy and great teacher has written. That's on 67 too. Method, the inner meaning. This comes from a sense of working through the nous, the inner meaning, working through that which is available to us through the nous, that which we apprehend through the nous, through the intellect. And then we begin to weave. We weave the relation between the inner meaning of Gregory's words and our own life. We weave the thinking between what Maximus calls Gregory's comparatively few words. We weave those few words together and see what schema, what pattern emerges from the constellation of St. Gregory's thinking, from the constellation of St. Gregory's praying, right? He gives us the archipoints. And this activity then becomes our common effort to draw unto our own, to comprehend what is of our own, to integrate, to paraphrase, to put into our own words, right? Maximus talks of his drawn out explanations. Maximus's drawn out explanations are his weaving between the principles or the foci of Gregory's thought. So that's in the prologue. And now turn to, this is beginning on page 69. And I just have a few remarks here as well in general, and then we'll look at a little passage before we move on. Ambiguum 6. On 71, Maximus points to proximity to God bringing peace and holiness, or rather, proximity to God is attended by peace and holiness. And that proximity to God, which involves intimate association with the intellect, this is also in 71, intimate association with the intellect, addresses our faculty of divine comprehension. It draws us into the noetic mode. Proximity of God draws us into the noetic mode, where, as on 71, one and all become slightly joined. So Maximus says that Gregory, through himself, holds a dialogue with humanity as a whole. Through himself, he holds dialogue with humanity as a whole. All right. So the essential, the integral, touches and addresses all, right? If something is essential or integral in one, it touches and addresses all. So Gregory's word is the opposite of a private word, or the opposite of a word curtailed off from life. Proximity to God and intimate association via the intellect, via the nous, with noetic reality, brings about joy. And I want to look from the bottom of 71 over to 72 for a moment. Maximus has a remarkable meditation, or kind of tripartite meditation, on the image of the womb, or in the image of the womb. But he begins with the image of Saint John the Forerunner, leaping for joy in his mother's womb upon being brought into proximity with Christ. So this is the last line on 71 over to 73, over the next page. For it is true, though it may be a jarring and unusual thing to say, that both man and God the Word, both man and the Word of God, the creator and master of the universe, exist in a kind of womb, owing to the present condition of our life. In this sense-perceptible world, this aesthetic world, just as if he were enclosed in a womb, the Word of God appears only obscurely and only to those who have the spirit of John the Baptist. That's the first image. Second, human beings, on the other hand, gazing through the womb of the material world, catch but a glimpse of the world, of the word, who is concealed within beings. And this again, only if they are endowed with John's spiritual gifts. For when compared to the ineffable glory and splendor of the age to come, and to the life that awaits us there, this present life differs in no way from a womb swathed in darkness, in which, for the sake of us who are infantile in mind, the infinitely perfect Word of God, who loves mankind, became an infant. All right, so what do we have here? We have a few things. This Ambigua is about the relation of body and soul, or rather the person's conception of the body, let's say. Here we have the material world as a womb in which is being prepared a resurrected body and soul. All right. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that we perceive Christ as if he were enclosed in a womb, as if his fullness is yet to be unfolded, yet to come. And then the third, compared to the ineffable glory and splendor of the age to come and to the kind of life that awaits us there. Well, here's where that just as if he were enclosed in the tomb becomes important. This as if makes our time sense a lens of perception of being. Maximus is not talking about time sense here. He's talking about ways of perceiving being. So this womb image is not about either origin or perfection, strictly speaking. It's assessment of the ontological condition in which we find ourselves looking towards God. And the fullness that we seek in God is, strangely enough, given to us in temporal language as the future, right? We talked about the past, remembering the past last week. The fullness that we seek in God is about the future. It's cast in future terms. But this future is not, let's say, its coming is an ontological rather than temporal matter. So John Zizioulas, the great theologian, he calls his book on eschatology, Remembering the Future, right? And in the liturgy, during the anaphora, the part of the liturgy in which prayer is uplifted in a kind of specifically dedicated way, there's a prayer in which we thank the Lord for all those things that have come to pass for us. And then things are listed: the cross, the tomb, the resurrection on the third day, the ascension, and the second and glorious great coming. These things have all happened in time from the perspective of the Logos, right? So this womb imagery, it's a tortuous way of getting back to this. This womb imagery is not about time. It's about an ontological condition, but it helps to heal our sense of past and future and what we think of in terms when we think of fullness or fulfillment or coming into being. Just beneath that section on 73, Maximus references Gregory's phrase, a deiform habit of mind. He says that we can see these things when we are in the habit, or when we have a deiform habit of mind, and we cannot perceive these things when we grow lax regarding the deiform habit of mind. Deiform habit of mind. This is a rhythm of thinking, It's a habit, a rhythm of relating out of a sense of the divine presence in all things. Deiform. The word in Greek means something akin to God formed or God imaged, God shaped. This God formed habit would recognize in St. Gregory's words that Maximus is discussing recognize that Gregory is just giving us phrases with emphases, not denigrating the body, not casting it down to a secondary status. He is emphasizing an aspect of the struggle in terms of the soul and body, or the spirit and body. So this ambiguum, Maximus is saying he's talking about something integral here. The person of Christ is integral. It's not bound by time, even if we think it is. And it is, as it were, one and all. The integrity of the human being is such that all of humanity is imaged there. Let's put it that way. All right, let's move on to Ambiguum 7 now. The main thing we need to address. This deiform habit of mind. So then we ask, how are we with the divine? How are we with the divine? And that's really the question of Ambiguum 7. I'll try to move through these thoughts. I want to read out a handful of longer passages that we can return to later as well. But I'll move through my own thoughts with some pacing to keep us going. Ambiguum 7 on page 75. I'm going to read the extract from St. Gregory. This is from Gregory's oration on love for the poor. What is this wisdom that concerns me? And what is this great mystery? Or is it God's will that we, who are a portion of God that has flowed down from above, not become exalted and lifted up on account of this dignity, and so despise our Creator? Or is it not rather that, in our struggle and battle with the body, we should always look to him, so that this very weakness that has been yoked to us might be an education concerning our dignity? What is this wisdom that concerns me, and what is this great mystery? Or is it God's will that we, who are a portion of God that has flowed down from above, not become exalted and lifted up on account of this dignity, and so despise our Creator? Or is it not rather that, in our struggle and battle with the body, there's more emphases right there, we should always look to him, so that this very weakness that has been yoked to us might be an education concerning our dignity? Okay, so we have three things here: wisdom and mystery. So we're asking, what is offered? What's the wisdom being offered? What is withheld in the mystery? That's the first question. And then portion and flowing. So the question is, how are we of God? How are we of God? That's a question of portion. And flowing, how are we of movement? How do we partake of movement? So that's the second question. And the third theme, wisdom, mystery, portion, flowing. The third theme is struggle and dignity. So what is the relation and integrity of soul and body? Because we understand that there is a relation and integrity there. All right. Now, on 79, Maximus begins his ambiguum by pointing to our enduring abiding in the beautiful, or he rather gestures towards the beautiful as our anchor and our compass. It's phrased rhetorically. He says, if we are not to be anchored in the beautiful, what will become of us? And if we do not choose to return or to go to the beautiful, what have we made of ourselves? But let's put it just positively in the way that he's describing the beautiful. So the beautiful, to abide in the beautiful means to dwell with, to kalon. To kalon is the good beautiful. We've seen this word before. The beautiful, the good beautiful is that which calls to us, which is our abode, which is our dwelling place, which draws us near. So Maximus anchors and gives us our compass in the beautiful. And then the second immediate thing that Maximus delineates is, and this is at the top of 81, or rather the bottom of the paragraph that begins 81. he speaks about God's love, excuse me, God's love through which all things created by God are naturally gathered up in God, permanently and without change or deviation. So we have our abode, our dwelling place, our anchor, and our compass, and that which has gathered us. That's how he begins. Gathering here is the first movement of integration. Gathering is the beginning of presence. And the beautiful, to kalon, or divine love, is that which is gathered and gathers unto itself, unto its own. God has already gathered us to himself, and he gathers us to himself. So anchoring and gathering. And then Maximus begins the portion in which he begins to address the theme, which is the relation of movement and rest to being and generation. So turn to page 87, please. I'm going to read over to 89, 87 to 89, if you will. And here's where he begins to address Genesis, Kinesis, Stasis, or becoming, movement, stasis. If then rational creatures, this is halfway down 87, rational creatures are created being, then surely they are subject to motion, since they are moved from their natural beginning in being toward a voluntary end in will-being. We remember this language of being and will-being from last time. For the end of the motion of things that are moved to rest within eternal well-being itself, for the end of the motion of things that are moved is to rest within eternal well-being itself, just as their beginning was being itself, which is God, who is the giver of being and the bestower of the grace of well-being. For he is the beginning and the end. For from God come both our general power of motion, for he is our beginning, and the particular way that we are moved towards him. We're going to come back to that phrase. And the particular way that we are moved towards him, for he is our end. If a noetic being is moved intellectively, that is, in a manner appropriate to itself, then it will surely become a knowing intellect. But if it knows, it surely loves that which it knows. And if it loves, it surely suffers an ecstasy toward it as an object of love. If it suffers this ecstasy, it obviously urges itself onward. And if it urges itself onward, it surely intensifies and greatly accelerates its motion. And if its motion is intensified in this way, it will not cease until it is wholly present in the whole beloved and wholly encompassed by it, willingly receiving the whole saving circumscription by its own choice, so that it might be wholly qualified by the whole circumscriber, and being wholly circumscribed will no longer be able to wish to be known from its qualities, but rather from those of its circumscriber. Okay. There's a lot here. I want to pick out just a couple of things. From God comes not only our beginning and our end, but as Maximus says, the particular way that we move towards it, i.e., the phrasing of our being, right? The phrasing of our being, the movement of our being is of God. There's that term of God again. The progression for Maximus is a being is moved, and due to its own nature, it is a knowing being. Knowing is inwardly formed, or inwardly forms loving, and loving inwardly forms ecstasis, or a stance of ecstasy. Ecstasy really means ecstasis of the stance, but it could be translated into the phrase of one stance unto. So to be ecstasy is of one stance unto another. Or We could say ecstasy means standing out of oneself for another, standing out of oneself for another, or surmounting one's own for the sake of another, surmounting one's own for the sake of another. The ecstasis, the standing out, is important because it answers Neoplatonic and other charges of movement from God or partaking of God's essence. So the progression is movement to knowing, knowing to loving, loving to ecstasis, ecstasy, ecstasy. Now, this knowing, Maximus gives us a couple of very interesting ways of thinking about what we mean by knowing. What we mean by knowing. And this is on page 89 and 91. He uses the image of imagery. He uses the metaphor of imagery. He says, following immediately this last passage, for these examples, we are able conjecturally to derive, from these examples, we are able conjecturally to derive an image, not of that participation in goodness, which existed long ago and fell into corruption, so not what he's rejecting, but that of which the worthy shall partake in the age to come. There's the bypassing of time. We have an image of the age to come. And I say an image because what we hope for is beyond all images, surpassing vision and hearing and understanding, according to scripture. Image here is icon. We recall from last year that icon is the supreme form of knowing for Maximus. But an image here is understood in the sense of an articulated presence, an articulated presence. It's a matter of aesthetic comprehension, a matter of aesthetic comprehension. An image gives the whole and yet is of the whole. Doesn't represent, or it is of the whole. So an image gives the whole, but it is of the whole. And all images are, or rather involve and are informed by the incarnate logos, right? There is flesh and life in an image that there isn't in a concept or an idea. And this is the top of 91. Rather affirming our fixed and unchanging natural disposition, that is, a voluntary surrender of the will, so that from the same source whence we received our being, our Lord, we should also long to receive being moved, like an image that has ascended to its archetype, corresponding to it completely in the way that an impression corresponds to its stamp. So now we have image and archetype. Archetype here is that which calls forth, that which establishes, preserves, renders fruitful, and provides the environment of relation for the image. Right? The archetype gives the meaning image. It's the giving or the letting be or the offering or the making of the image. That's the relationship of archetype to image. So what kind of knowledge does this impart to us? This is also on 93. As we draw near to God and we move beyond knowing to loving and loving to ecstasis, knowledge ceases to be the engine of our desire. Everything, all intelligible and sensible things, that by which we know, will be enveloped in the ineffable manifestation and presence of God, says Maximus. Enveloped in the ineffable manifestation and presence of God. That's page 93. In the ineffable manifestation and presence of God, all perceptual and conceptual activity will cease. the only thing left is enjoyment in participation in God. Right. But this participation in knowledge, or participation beyond knowledge, rather, when Maximus says we will seek trying to know, and we will just be with, this being with beyond being unto, is something that I'm not sure if we can glimpse now, because all of our participation and partaking of is marked by knowledge, some kind of knowledge. And so when Maximus says on 93, when the image ascends to the archetype it now longs after, that longing is a movement beyond knowing. So the relation of image and archetype is not something knowing its own exactly. There's another relationship there. And actually let's move into thinking about the logos and the logi now, the logi, because this is where the relationship becomes clear. So we're on 95 moving forward now. Images and archetype, logi and logos, phrasing and koinonia, these are all ways of knowing or ways of longing after what is known, and therefore what is also unknown and beyond unknowing. Images, logi, phrasing, this is what we have ready to hand. Now, regarding the logos and the logi, the relationship of the logos and the logi, or logi, is a deep mystery. I want us to ponder this. We're weaving this in silence in the background of this whole session. As is that of archetype to image, or the father of communion to good phrasing. So the relationship of the logos to the logi is a deep mystery. And yet this relationship is figured. It's figured. It's given figure, given aesthetic form, given form in the person of Christ, who is the logos become flesh. So the relationship between image and archetype, logi and logos, phrasing and koinonia, is a figure of Christ, the person of Christ. And now I want to read from 95 a little bit, and then over to 97 to 99. At the bottom of 95, I want to read just the first few lines of the last full paragraph, beginning from all eternity. And this is page 95, from all eternity. It's in the section, the logos and the logi. From all eternity, he contained within himself the pre-existing logoi of created being. When in his goodwill, he formed out of nothing the substance of the visible and invisible worlds, he did so on the basis of these logoi. That's the first thing I want us to note. And then over the page, just 4 lines down. And this is just astonishing. It's astonishing what he says here. This is one of the major passages I want to come back to. A logos of human beings likewise preceded their creation. And, in order not to speak of particulars, a logos preceded the creation of everything that has received its being from God. A logos preceded the creation of everything that has received its being from God. We believe that he himself, by virtue of his infinite transcendence, is ineffable and incomprehensible, and exists beyond all creation and beyond all differences and distinctions which exist and can be conceived of within it. We also believe that this same one is manifested and multiplied in all the things that have their origin in him, in a manner appropriate to the being of each, as befits his goodness. And he recapitulates all things in himself, for it is owing to him that all things exist and remain in existence. And it is from him that all things came to be in a certain way, and for a certain reason, and whether they are stationary or in motion, participate in God. For by virtue of the fact that all things have their being from God, they participate in God in a manner appropriate and proportionate to each, whether by intellect, by reason, by sensation, by vital motion, or by some essential faculty or habitual fitness, according to the great theologian Gregory the Dionysius the Areopagite. It follows then that each of the intellective and rational beings, whether angels or men, insofar as it has been created in accordance with the Logos that exists in and with God, in accordance with the Logos that exists in and with God, is and is called a portion of God. That's Maximus's clause. A portion of God, precisely because of that Logos, which, as we said, pre-exists in God. If such a being moves according to its Logos, it comes to be in God, in whom its Logos of being pre-exists, as its origin and cause. As long as it wishes and yearns to know nothing apart from its own origin, it does not flow away from God, but rather in an upward movement toward God. It becomes God, or in its upward movement toward God, it becomes God and is said to be a portion of God through its proper mode of participation in God, because according to nature, wisely and rationally, and through a properly ordered movement, it attains its own origin and cause, having nowhere else to be moved besides its own beginning, or beyond the ascent and restoration of the Logos according to which it was created, the Logos according to which it was created, nor any other way of being moved, since its movement toward the divine goal clearly takes at its final limit the divine goal itself. Okay, that's Logos and Logi, but he also talks about the end of movement, the cessation of movement. So the Logos precedes ontology. That's the first thing to take. Logos precedes being for us. Second, the one is beyond all distinction. The one is beyond all distinction. All distinction happens with the logi. Third, all existence is of God, or put another way, God moves apophatically in all existence. So Logos precedes being. The one is beyond all distinction. All existence is of God, and God moves apophatically in all existence. Now, there's a second part here that I want to point to too, though, and that is existence appropriate beyond time. There's an existence appropriate beyond time that will actually, just 1 second. Yeah, let's move to 99. I'm just going to read the beginning of 99 over to 101 and continue this thought. In God, the logoi of all things are steadfastly fixed, and it is on the basis of these things that God is said to know all things before they come into being. For an absolute truth, in him and with him are all things. For an absolute truth, in him and with him are all things, even though all things, things present and things to come, were not called into existence simultaneously with their logoi or with their being known by God. That proceeds. Instead, in the wisdom of the Creator, individual things were created at the appropriate moment in time, in a manner consistent with their logoi, and thus they receive in themselves actual existence as beings. For God is eternally an active creator, but creatures exist first in potential and only later in actuality, since it is not possible for the infinite and the finite to exist simultaneously on the same level of being. Indeed, no argument will ever be able to demonstrate the simultaneous interdependence of being and what transcends being. or of the measureless and what is subject to measurement, or that the absolute can be ranked with the relative, or that something of which no specific category can positively be predicated can be placed in the same class as what is constituted by all the categories. For in their substance and formation, all created things are positively defined by their own logi, by the logi that exist around them and which constitute their defining limits. All right, and stay on this page because we're gonna move on from here. I just want to note two things. In him and with him are all things. In him and with him are all things. Bypassing time, answering our questions of origin and end. In him and with him are all things. That's the first. The second is, in this phrase, in the wisdom of the creator, individual things were created at the appropriate, this is top of 101, appropriate moment in time in a manner consistent with their logi, and thus they received in themselves actual existence as beings. Now, this is amazing. Not only is all things ingathered in God, but God draws into existence each thing appropriately. Each thing in existence is fully its own. Each person is present. Each person is fully and is in their own. Each person, each thing belongs deeply beyond our considerations of time. It lends an interesting gloss to the word appropriate form. Now I want to continue on page 101 here. Let's see here. Okay. Just to read the last paragraph of page 101 over to 102 and offer a few thoughts about this. This is a passage in which he addresses apophasis. He talks about the logos and then about the one and the many too. So a number of very important themes are wrapped up here in short order. This is immediately following his discussion we just looked at on the logos and the logi. When, however, we exclude the highest form of negative theology concerning the logos, according to which the logos is neither called nor considered, nor is in his entirety anything that can be attributed to anything else, since is beyond all being and is not participated in by any being whatsoever. When, I say, we set this way of thinking aside, the one logos is many logi, and the many are one. According to the creative and sustaining procession of the one to individual beings, which is befitting of divine goodness, the one is many. According to the revertive, inductive, and providential return of the many to the one, as if to an all-powerful point of origin, or to the center of a circle pre-containing the beginnings of the radii originating from it, insofar as the one gathers everything together, the many are one. We are then and are called portions of God because of the logi of our being that exist eternally in God. All right, now, first we have a quick characterization of apophatic thought. He's saying, setting aside the highest form of apophasis. Setting aside the highest form of apophasis is in his entirety, which is an astonishing phrase. God in his entirety is beyond all things, right? Apophatic thinking gives us a sense of that, but apart from that, no. We set aside this way of thinking, this way of phrasing it, this method of including it in the dance, in the composition. All right? A way of thinking is just a way of gathering, a way of phrasing. We're setting that aside. And then he turns to the logos, the one and the many. Christos Yannaras defines the logos as the mode by which everything that is becomes manifest or known. The mode by which everything that is becomes manifest or known. Here, the logos, we could say, is that through which one's own is phrased. That through which one's own is phrased. One's own is phrased through the logos. And then just a comment on the one and the many. To set aside apophatic thinking is to make room for the provisional, let's say, focus or emphasis of aesthetic form, one and many. From the perspective of that which gathers, our Lord is one. From the perspective of the life-giving procession of life to all beings, our Lord is many. Okay. And now turn to page 1105, please. This is the other major passage that I want to look at. Okay, 105. It's the first full paragraph. We'll begin there, and we'll go over to 107. Okay, this is he's talking about a person on the path to theosis. In such a person, the apostolic word is fulfilled, which says, "In him we live and move and have our being." For he comes, the person undergoing theosis, comes to be in God through attentiveness, since he has not falsified the logos of being that pre-exists in God. And he moves in God in accordance with the logos of well-being that pre-exists in God, since he is moved to action by the virtues. And he lives in God in accordance with the logos of eternal being, which also pre-exists in God. In this life, he has already become one with himself and immovable, owing to his state of supreme impassibility. And in the age to come, through the divinization, the theosis, which will be given to him, he will love and cleave affectionately to the aforementioned logi that pre-exist in God, or rather he will love and cleave affectionately to God himself, in whom the logi of beautiful things are steadfastly fixed. He is a portion of God then, insofar as he exists, for he owes his existence to the logos of being that is in God. And he is a portion of God insofar as he is good, for he owes his goodness to the logos of well-being that is in God. And he is a portion of God insofar as he is God, owing to the logos of his eternal being that is in God. In honoring these logi and acting in accordance with them, he places himself wholly in God alone, forming and configuring God alone throughout his entire being, so that he himself by grace is and is called God, just as God by his condescension is and is called man for the sake of man. And also so that the power of this reciprocal disposition might be shown forth herein, a power that divinizes man through his love for God and humanizes God through his love for man. And by this beautiful exchange, it renders God man by reason of the divinization of man, and renders man God by reason of the incarnation of God. For the logos of God, who is God, wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. Okay. I want to begin here in a few minutes for our discussion, so I'm only going to say a few things. This passage is astonishing. But I want to make three notes, a few notes. That phrase, in accordance with the logos of God, that is the Greek word kata. Kata means in accordance with. We often think of kata as kataphasis, right? Cataphatic, in accordance with the word, phasis, the saying. This is the word with which apophasis, the apophatic, is contrasted, not positive. So it's according to the word, cataphasis, according to the word. Apophasis means from the word or of the word or moving beyond the word. That's what apo means. So negative and positive does not translate these terms adequately at all. Second, I want to pose this as a question. This is the last sentence I read, and we can come back to this. This is what Maximus writes. The Logos of God, who is God, wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. To accomplish the mystery of his embodiment, wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment, the mystery of Christ's incarnation. That is the transformative events that we should seek. And then his wonderful, Maximus's wonderful gloss on integrity, where approximately halfway down 105, he refers to the person undergoing divinization as one who has already become one with himself. So integrity is to become one with yourself. David Goa, you were talking about the bifurcation of the self and the garden last session. Becoming one with yourself, as one with yourself, at one with yourself. Now, we are told that God knows his creatures via his pre-existing logi that he has given to each. God knows us and knows all creation through his immortal logi. And how do we know God? Let's return to this question now. This is the conclusion of the first part of his Ambiguum, beginning on page 109. Unsurprisingly, our primary task is one of receptiveness, of spiritual readiness or ripeness, receptiveness. On page 109, Maximus puts this in a pithy way. In each case, i.e., in each case that God will recognize his own, in each case, the voluntary decision to move either in accord with the will and logos of God or against it prepared each person to hear the divine voice. The voluntary decision to move either in accord with the will and logos of God or against it prepared each person to hear the divine voice. Hearing the divine voice is our gift of being. If that which is divine within is cultivated, if we cultivate the implanted word of God, the logos of God in ourselves, we will be able to hear the divine voice. And then over to page 111, just over the page. And here he talks about drawing near. So having heard, we draw near. This is 3 lines down. Gregory also speaks indirectly of what this blessed state will be like in the future and urges on those who in hope are purifying themselves for and hastening to this unyielding enjoyment, which will never cease or change. For if he knew that we are to progress simply and in a straight course, in accord with reason and nature, toward that which is reflected in our substance and intellect, without any kind of searching whatsoever, for only in searching is there the possibility of stumbling and going astray. If we were able to direct simply and in a straight course, we too, as much as is possible for us, would know all things in a godlike way, no longer being held back in ignorance by the motion that envelops them, because our intellect, reason, logos, and spirit have drawn near to the great intellect, logos, and spirit. And indeed, our whole self will have returned to the whole God as an image to its archetype. Drawing near is a simple and straight course to God, drawing near to God. It does not take the form of searching by one's own lights or in one's own willed way, right? It is response, it is receptiveness. And Maximus writes, our whole self will have returned to the whole God as an image to its archetype. This deepens and clarifies, or he's deepening and clarifying the mystery of movement. Right? This is a movement of fullness or fulfillment, not of achievements or progress of one's own. Right? Fullness or fulfillment, not an act and accomplishment. Page 113. Here he is talking about theosis now, so he's moving one up from drawing near. And this is about 9 lines down from the top of 113. It begins the life that God will give, the life that God will give, about 9 lines down. The life that God will give does not consist in the breathing of air or in the flow of blood from the liver, but in the fact that God will be wholly participated by human beings, so that he will be to the soul, as it were, what the soul is to the body. And through the soul, he will likewise be present in the body in a manner that he knows, so that the soul will receive immutability and the body immortality. In this way, man as a whole will be divinized, being made God by the grace of God who became man. Man will remain wholly man in soul and body, owing to his nature, but will become wholly God in soul and body, owing to the grace and the splendor of the blessed glory of God, which is wholly appropriate to him, and beyond which nothing more splendid or sublime can be imagined. What could be more desirable to those who are worthy of it than divinization? For through it, God is united with those who have become gods, and by his goodness makes all things his own. And by his goodness makes all things his own. This is an absolutely remarkable passage. 2 things I want to note. This is another passage I want to return to. The soul receives immutability. The body, immortality. Think about that. The soul receives immutability from the divine, and the body, immortality. And then this idea that we will be both wholly our own and wholly his own, which is a mystery beyond comprehension. Wholly our own and wholly his own. Now, just to tidy up this a little bit. On page 115, Maximus writes at the end of the first paragraph, thus the whole of inspired scripture, as well as our holy fathers who from it learnt divine mysteries, affirm that joy is the most appropriate name for the truth that is to come. This is joy as aletheia. I bring thee good tidings of great joy. It's the gospel message, joy. And we forget, we think it's about thinking or arguing. So joy is the form of aletheia. Joy is that which will bring into light, will draw into presence, right? And integrity of form becomes sincerity of relation, becomes the joy of communion. That's what we're given through this ambiguum here. All right, let's pause there. And why don't we return to, let's go back to page 105, just where we began this series of intense passages. And Michael, would you mind reading out, just reread the passage that we just read out together, and then begin to think about it, and we'll join you in thinking.
Can you
Yeah, it's the first full
Directly to
paragraph
the,
on page 105. In such a
it-
person,
okay, that's quite a long,
and
and
just
then,
over to even over to the end of the section on the page.
okay. In such a person, the apostolic word is fulfilled, which says, in him we live and move and have our being, for he comes to be in God through attentiveness, since he has not falsified the logos of being that pre-exists in God, and he moves in God in accordance with the logos of well-being that pre-exists in God. Since he has moved to action by the virtues, and he lives in God in accordance with the logos of eternal being that also pre-exists in God. In this life, he has already become one with himself and immovable, owing to his state of supreme impassibility, and in the age to come, through the divinization which will be given to him, he will love and cleave affectionately to the aforementioned logoi that pre-exist in God, or rather he will love and cleave affectionately to God himself, in whom the logoi of beautiful things are steadfastly fixed. He is a portion of God then, insofar as he exists, for he owes his existence to the logos of being that is in God, and he is a portion of God insofar as he is good, for he owes his goodness to the logos of well-being that is in God, and he is a portion of God insofar as he is God, owing to the logos of his eternal being that is in God. In honoring these logoi and acting in accordance with them, he places himself wholly in God alone, forming and configuring God alone through his entire being, so that he himself by grace is called God, just as God by his condensation is and is called man for the sake of man. And also so that the power of this reciprocal disposition might be shown forth herein, a power that divinizes man through his love of God and humanizes God through his love for man. And by this beautiful exchange, it renders God man by reason of the divinization of man, and man God by reason of the incarnation of God. For the logos of God, who is God, wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. Amen.
What stands out, Michael? Begin to walk us into this. Let's walk into this. I mean, this is such a rich passage, and Maximus in his phrasing and his term, there's a lot there.
There is a lot. So just to hang, there's so many hooks that aren't discrete, and that's the part of the difficulty. And so maybe just focusing, walking backwards from that last statement, that the logos of God wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. And earlier there's reference to God in his eternity, but more extraordinarily man existing in God's eternity. I'm paraphrasing that probably inaccurately. And I'm just going to focus on that just for a moment, because it harkens back to an extraordinary claim on near the top of page 101, the same Ambigua, the second full sentence. For God is eternally an active creator, And then it says, but creatures exist in potential and only later in actuality, but God is eternally an active creator. So that I suppose that's one of the many things that we try to cope with when we're thinking of the logos of God, willing always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. That presumably is a feature of his eternal creativeness. And I'll throw this in because it's just as a potential kind of background intellectual context that obviously Maximus was sensitive to, because the whole discussion of motion and rest comes out of that canonical discussion in the Metaphysics of Aristotle in book 10, I believe, in which, pardon me, I mean, it comes out of that, but it also relates to another passage in the Nicomachean Ethics when he's talking about the divine, and Aristotle talks about the divine purely in terms, and he actually fends off the notion of God being creative rather oddly and focuses totally on God as contemplative. And I'm not meaning to bring Aristotle up short, because I don't really know exactly what Aristotle meant. It seems to me that contemplation involves creativity, but certainly it seems to be something that Maximus emphasizes when he sees God as an eternally creative being. And I think that's, I'm emphasizing this because I think it might be both a stumbling block and something a productive assertion to bear in mind when we're contemplating God's mystery, because there's always the danger of rigidifying or crystallizing our concept, and the very idea of a mystery should encourage us to resist that temptation. So I've kind of gone on a little bit. I just wanted to say how it struck me. So I'll stop there and see if anyone would like to respond or divert a little bit away from what I was espousing just now. Not espousing, that's the wrong word, rather, you know, glossing right now.
So Michael, you're linking this phrase, the logos of God, who is God, wills excuse me, always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment, with the creative nature of God. Is this a creative act then that you're seeing in the?
I think everything God does is, because we can focus on the logos and the logoi being pre-existing, standing outside of time. That's all well and good, but as soon as we feel like we have our hands on something, I think it also dissolves, because we don't really know what that might mean. But whatever creativity means, it's not like God is hemmed in, like a being contemplating a reality that is pre-existing. It seems to he's both creating reality and it's eternal. So you might say it's pre-existing, but there's something radically mysterious about this. This is what I'm saying, not very well, because we're invited. I mean, not just, I mean, we're supposedly made in the image of God, and that's reinforced in this long passage that I read out in several ways. And so if we, and it's clear that we're not meant to, you know, to imagine that we can, you know, you emphasized earlier on that we're not meant to assume that we come into closer to God and we're gathered up according to some kind of Abelian struggle, or through the work of our intellect as such. But at the same time, we don't want to imagine that the intellect wrapped up in a creativity that is more apophatic in nature is dissolving us into something that seems to resemble nothing. I'll stop on that kind of provocative assertions. It might. I'm not sure if I'm anticipating a strain of temptation that we might be led into, but that's sort of what I'm driving at.
Is creativity receptive, Michael?
I think in us, given
So.
the hierarchy of our relationship, it necessarily would be kind of madness to assume that it's something that is going off in a different infinity. So the infinity has to be gathered up. And I hesitate to use the word because remember when we were talking about the theandric energies in Ambigua 5 last week, there was this wonderful kind of bolstering of the sense of paradox behind theandric energies, and that they're neither simple nor composite, and they're neither one or many. And this is kind of a gloss on our discussion of the one and many. That's a kind of more of a cataphatic way of speaking, I suppose. And so I'm sort of listing more toward the mystery side of things, the apophatic side of things. But even then, sorry for a long-winded reply, but clearly, yes.
Creation is also figured liturgically in terms of giving and making. Are those echoes decent, David? Giving, I'm thinking the giver of life, maker of all. And life giver, the giver of life, making life, zoe poiesis, doesn't mean biological life. It means the life of meaning. And poiesis is where we get poetry from. So life giver is like the divine that gives poetry to life, that gives beautiful meaning to life.
Maybe I don't want to move away from this. Maybe I'll just put something else on the table here. For the Logos of God, who is God. It's always interesting to think of that, because so much theology has been done to describe the nature or qualities of God as creator, as if that was distinct from the incarnation. The Logos of God, who is God, wills always and in all things, always and in all things, to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. And his embodiment is the logoi. The logoi that where the will has come home. So maybe I can ask this as a question. So often in the Christian habit of mind is to think of Jesus Christ as the incarnation, and that is a revelation that occurs 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, on Golgotha, on the empty tomb, on the road to Emmaus. But this seems to suggest to me that the incarnation, I mean, it's not obviously that is, that's there. It's in the gospel, but it isn't the point. The point of the incarnation isn't a historical incident, even if that incident is claimed to be the incarnation of God in a human being. But rather, the incarnation, the revelation of the incarnation, and Maximus's consideration here, is not about history, but it's about well-being. It's a revelation about well-being. It's not an incident. It's about well, I think, Andrew, you had a way of saying this in the past about some kind of, well, stasis. It's about this opening, I guess I would put it is about this opening to presence in the world. So does anybody else hear this in it? And I'd be particularly interested in, David, what you have to say about this way of thinking about things. And also Amit. So the incarnation as a revelation, as an unveiling of a mystery, is unveiling the mystery of the being of the human in all times and places.
David, that's
So,
the sense.
for the Logos of God wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. Yeah, I'm sorry, Amit.
No, I was going to say that's the sense I am starting to get from reading Maximus more and more, is that this, and I'm speaking obviously as someone who is outside the tradition, so please forgive me if I misstep. But the sense I'm getting is that the incarnation, as you say, is not simply a moment in time, a historical time, but the very form, maybe the main form, or one of the central forms of being as a human, that it infuses every kind of interaction with oneself or with God. And that's as I read more and more, it's becoming both less clear and more clear. And to use a word that Andrew uses and you use a lot, the mystery is becoming more full. It's just gaining in depth and fullness as I read more and engage more, but I think also as the individual lives more and engages with God more, the mystery just grows. And that isn't synonymous with understanding or grasping. For me, the more I engage with this, the more I get the sense that the mystery, it's really about the mystery. That, and I'm starting to ramble a little bit, so I'm going to stop here because, as I told Andrew earlier, this requires a lot more time for me to process properly. Also, being an outsider. But just to sum up the point that you just made, David, the idea that the incarnation is not simply a historical fact or a fact in a certain time, but that it's something much larger and for all time. I think that is that's, to me, that constitutes a large part of the mystery of this incarnation. And I hope I will have something a little bit more articulate and intelligible to say about this as we move forward, because, as I said, I'm just coming to an understanding of some of these things. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Yeah, just to make it clear, here, I'm outside of this too.
Yeah.
I am. You're not any more outside than any of the rest of us are.
David, and what you say is just so pregnant to draw on that image of the womb. But without disagreeing with what you said, the specificity of the, let's call it the historical incarnation, to distinguish it, that it's not only an example of what it means to be human or to bring to light what it means to be human, it transforms it as well. So it isn't another instance of what it means to be human. I think there's a transformational aspect to it that existed in a way that the incarnation of the Logi in its separateness and uniqueness of every person prior to the historical incarnation, but after the fall, at least, let's take that one, that's easy, I think is qualitatively different than the historical incarnation. And we see that, I think that Maximus perhaps either is assuming it, but he certainly speaks in several places here about it's through grace that we are, divinization is through grace, even though, of course, it's the diligent pursuit of contemplation and the virtues, but still ultimately it's about grace, it's about receptivity, it's about revelation. It's not anyway, so all of that, and I think that the historical incarnation transforms. So I don't disagree with you that the incarnations reveal to us what it means to be human on a far more grandly than we might otherwise think. But I think part of it is because the historical incarnation has transformed what that means.
I think that's a really, really good addition. So what then would you say about this last line here, that the Logos wills
always and in all things
of his embodiment? Is that, in Maximus, this is the, in a sense, this sense that the logoi of all being longs for its perfection.
Yep.
It longs for the presence that is there in origin, in image, but is called to in likeness.
I'm thinking that you're throwing a very slow pitch right across the plate for me. But for those who aren't used to his teasing of me about predestination, I think it's pretty hard to avoid that word here. And Maximus himself points to it. But I think that the ultimate will of God is the recapitulation of Jesus Christ as its head, and that will be fulfilled. But it will be fulfilled in a way through grace where humans will realize what the incarnation means to be human and realize the breadth and depth of the mystery of the divinization of theosis.
Can I add one thing? I just want to clarify something that I said earlier, or just add to it, is that just back to the mystery, something a little bit personal. As a lapsed Muslim, I think about
we're all lapsed Muslims as well, as Islam teaches. I mean, it teaches with real clarity about that.
But at least you're not a Protestant, is what David really wants to say to you. But I'll have to get off the line first.
As a lapsed Muslim, one of the things that I'd always had an issue with is that, and it's something that as I read Maximus now, I'm beginning to see it more clearly, is that my tradition, or my lapsed tradition, very much is rooted in a corpus of laws or consensus, and that mediates the spiritual experience of the individual very deeply. Whereas the way that Maximus is speaking about the incarnation and the mystery, one of the things I deeply appreciate about your tradition is that the individual can be rooted in a corpus of mystery, how to be rooted in mystery, and for that to live in it and through it, and yet not be bereft of a certainty of a closeness, a feeling of real closeness with God, but to live in that mystery. Andrew uses this word all the time, and I'm starting to understand it better now. The idea of dwelling with. I think this tradition, your tradition, has a very, very deep sense of what it means to dwell with God. And that's something that, as I read Maximus more and more, it's starting to unfold itself in all fullness.
Ahmed, I don't know the Muslim tradition nearly well enough, but
it's a kind of Presbyterianism, David.
Yeah. In my encounters, I would have thought that the Sufi tradition would describe much of what you say. Doesn't, the going from rules to mystery, going from adherence to dwelling with. I would think that would be reflected in the Sufi tradition, would it not?
Yes, but by way of response, I'll just say that I think what's remarkable in someone like Maximus is that he can join what is intelligible and rational to what is of the mystery in a way that's just incredibly generous, and, to use the word, responsive. The Sufi in the Islamic tradition, this is unfortunate, but the Sufis are essentially, on the whole, they're perceived as cultish. They're kind of esoteric, kind of an esoteric thorn in the side of that corpus of consensus. and tends to be spiritually sidelined unless you know it's the equivalent, I would say, perhaps to in your tradition to becoming a Franciscan monk, but even more so, to just completely turn away from, again, that corpus of consensus, the canonical, essentially, which is why I appreciate Maximus, because he is in all of that. Everything is of a whole in his language and in his approach.
And maybe I mean, Franciscans are still well within our body, but
nothing against.
But no. I think
with all due
maybe
respect
snake
to the
charmers might be the.
With all due respect to the Franciscans, because I have a deep respect for the man from Assisi. Sorry.
Ahmed, keep that line of thinking, and let's pursue it a little bit. But I want you to do it by way of page 111. That idea that one can have a grounding or a foundation, not in the clarity of the law, to use Kundra's phrase, but in a mystery, which is nonetheless a basis. Certainty, I'm not sure about your use of the word certainty. I would resist that, I think. But you have also go back to that place and speak in terms of trust. And page 111. So I want you to think of what you see as the stasis or the stability of of Maximus, combined with your own insights around trust within a tradition, and apply that to page 111, where Maximus talks about only in searching is there the possibility of stumbling and going astray, right? Just to remind of that passage. If we were to progress simply and in a straight course, in accord with reason and nature, toward that which is reflected in our substance and intellect, without any kind of searching whatsoever, for only in searching is there the possibility of stumbling and going astray, we too, as much as is possible for us, would know all things in a godlike way, no longer being held back in ignorance, etc., etc. What do you see there, my friend? What do you see in that?
Can we just finish the sentence there, Andrew?
Mm-hmm.
Because our intellect, reason, logos, and spirit will have drawn near to that great intellect, logos, and spirit. Indeed, our whole self will have returned to the whole God as an image to its intellect.
Is this sure-footedness, Ahmed, that you're talking about? Is it resilience? Is it trust?
In this passage, to me, it seems more like your concept of drawing near. Actually, it's the idea that you've mentioned a lot about drawing near.
No, but I mean, in a simply and straight course, the drawing near, it's true. That's the movement. But it's a simply and a straight. I'm sorry, maybe I'm not being clear. I'm getting back to your idea that there can be a different basis than clear pillars of law or consensus, a different basis, right? But then you spoke of you used the word certainty. You wondered if there wasn't a certainty that someone like Maximus has at the center. And I'm suggesting maybe not certainty, but maybe trust, your own word from a few days ago, or sure-footedness. That's what I'm wondering, because it's very curious here. He seems to be against inquiry in this passage, but that's can't be what he means. So I'm wondering what you hear echoed in that. That's all. And if you don't hear anything, that's fine too.
What I hear echoed here is willing, the will. I remember earlier in the passage, and I can't I can't remember the page exactly, but they just talk about the voluntary surrender of the will, and the voluntary surrender of the will being.
It's just over the page.
Oh, is it the next page?
109. 109.
Yeah.
Near the bottom.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. In each case, the voluntary decision to move either in accord with the will and logos of God or against it prepared each person to hear the divine voice. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, he mentions it a little bit earlier through the voluntary surrender of the will, but I think there is a sustained kind of engagement with this idea of willing and what it can do, what its limits are. Maybe give me a few minutes to think about this, Andrew, if anybody else wants to kind of.
Yeah, let's open it up around this passage. Pardon me, go ahead.
No, I just had another little footnote response to some of what Ahmed said. I mean, I can't help but think of your ancestor, Ahmed al-Hallaj, brought before the Sharia court for blasphemy and taking a hold of his garment and saying, "There is nothing but Allah in this juba," for which they crucified him. I mean, to be, as it seems to me he was, to be so near to God that that is not a statement of pride or ego. It's simply a description.
It's even more paradoxical, David. The word he says in Arabic is an al-haq, which means, and al-haq is one of the 99 names of God in Islam, which and it translates essentially into I am the truth. But it's not meant in him identifying himself with the truth. It's actually, and I really hope, and I'm going to say this very tenuously, it might be close to saying something like, I am the theosis. I am with God. Yes, perhaps that's a little bit better. I am in and with God, to use the words from Maximus, which in Islam would have been inexcusable, which is why, again, I really appreciate what Maximus is doing, because it gives a bridge to the individual to actually have the godliest experience possible, a real bridge.
Well, Ahmed, without disappointing you too much, I could tell you I know quite a few people who might have a bit of heartburn hearing it who are Christian. So this is, there's a reason why my book is populated in the side notes of mostly exclamation marks, question marks, and wow written across it. This is just beautiful. And you're touching exactly on the right points.
And this is essentially what I've been trying to articulate about the mystery, because to me, the way that Maximus speaks about it, it's almost like its own way of knowing. It's the epistemology of the experience of God. It's like this mystery. This is how one becomes God, to live through the mystery. But what that means is something just of unfathomable depth. So again, another thing I appreciate is the way he speaks about it. So I don't know if we mentioned this. We've talked about this, but maybe I've talked about it with Andrew, which is this: the way Maximus speaks or writes is so unrhetorical. He's so unconcerned with making an argument or speaking. He's dwelling with. He's essentially dwelling with, and he's inviting the reader to dwell with him and with the tradition. There's a stance of generosity, which again animates the mystery, the fullness of the mystery. It's all of a piece. I think this is what's to me the most deeply impressive about Maximus. The integrity of everything. That sounds strange, but the integrity of all. It's
the tradition speaking through him.
yeah.
Then his notion that, I mean, the phrase that, what's the phrase he uses, that that all creation has at its center, he uses the phrase a portion of God.
Yeah.
Be nice to know if you can ferret out Greek and Andrew and Michael, the Greek of that, a portion of God. So this theosis then is simply, I mean, is it anything other than simply being present to the mystery of that portion of God and whatever addresses us in life, whatever we meet?
His equating the portion of God with a member of the body, which I think I do love the portion of the body, the portion of God, but the difficulty with that phrasing in English, at least, is that one sees that if that portion is removed, that somehow there's something less than complete. Now, obviously, that's not true of God. So, you know, anyway, but so I'm playing with that. If one could have a non-quantitative understanding of portion, I think it is absolutely beautiful to see that. And
I think that
theosis.
sorry. I think that's what Maximus was working towards.
Oh,
or trying to
absolutely. I think
figure the relationship between logos
yeah.
and loge and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the joys, just because, you know, why not throw in more? And so this bonfire of theology, so blazing. One of the things that I wrote wow beside was just simply not only that by grace, that humans by grace is the man, he himself by grace is and is called God. Now that is earth-shattering. And then just as God by his condescension is and is called man for the sake of man. And then he says that there's a power that divinizes man through his love for God. So I think, David, it's that portion is not just simply an acquisition. It is an alignment with.
It's a presence.
It's the presence. So that love for God is just this. It isn't a forced response. It is the only response. But then
it's what we call communion.
Yeah, communion, exactly.
The experience of that.
And humanizes God through his love for man.
Yeah.
And that is, I guess, what the historical incarnation maybe articulates, that doesn't make it one of many incarnations, is that this is where God humanizes himself through his love for man. And to the extent that Christ, now in session with the Father and the Spirit, is in full human body. For as Maximus sets out later, we've got both soul and body. One's immutable, one's immortal, and you can't have them one before the other, or remaining after the other, but both.
Or without the other.
Without the other, yeah. I that to me was, I didn't think that was an important argument until I read it, and I realized just how central that is to the physical resurrection.
Why don't we read that, David? Why don't we read that and let's.
I'd love to do
let's
it. We
talk a
got
little
10
bit.
minutes, unfortunately, but we got about another 30 pages. I don't know if you want to do that
No,
for
no,
next
no.
time, but
No,
it's
this is just on 139. Turn to
okay.
139 and you read it out loud, David, for us.
Sure.
Because this is along with joy being the form of truth of the age to come.
Oh, yeah, is that
This
great?
this birth of the person is the most beautiful, astonishing thing that Maximus does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a so go to 139 and then
Where do you want me to start?
just about halfway down where he says the principle of origin and the principle of being are not the same.
Oh, yeah. By the way, before I get there, was there a typo? Yeah, the page before on 137. I don't want to sound like it actually is it's not just a grammatical, it's a more of a theological question. But in the paragraph that ends, relation would be destroyed, it says in the line above it, or 2 lines above it, indeed to exist after the other in time. Otherwise, what is known as the principle of reciprocal relation would be destroyed. I think that's an LE, isn't it? Not AL?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, it should
Okay,
be.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, all right.
Not
Okay,
an-
so because that clarifies the theological issue that we're talking about, a principle, not the main, but an
No,
ideal.
no.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so
It's
let me just
rare,
read.
but
Right. Okay. So let me just start from here then. Right. So let's start from the beginning of that sentence, which looks like it begins with. Let me just start from "it is impossible" because that's almost the only. It is
sure, yeah,
impossible. Yeah. It is impossible then for one form to change into another without suffering destruction. But if they should say that, because the soul is able to exist and subsist after the death and dissolution of the body, there is nothing to prevent it from existing and subsisting before the creation of the body, which seemed to me that their argument falls rather wide of the mark. And this for the simple reason that the principle of origin and the principle of being are not the same. The former concerns the when and the where of a thing, along with its reciprocal relation to something else. The latter concerns the what and the how of the thing, along with the basic fact of its existence. If this is so, then the soul, after it has come to be, remains eternally in existence on account of its essence. And this is not simply because it came to be, but because it did so in relation to a particular time and place and standing in a reciprocal relation to something else. For after the death of the body, the soul is not called soul in an unqualified way, but the soul of a man. Indeed, the soul of a particular human being. For even after the body, it possesses, as its own form, the whole human being, which is predicated of it by virtue of its relation as a part to the whole. The same holds in the case of the body, which is corruptible by nature, but has a particular relation on account of its origin. For the body, after its separation from the soul, is not simply called body, even though it will decompose and be dissolved into the elements from which it came, or from which it was constituted, but the body of a man, indeed of a particular man. For like the soul, it possesses the form of the whole human being predicated of it, by virtue of its relation as part of the whole. Thus, the relation of the two, by which I mean soul and body, as the whole human form, which parts can be separated only in thought, reveals that both come into being simultaneously and demonstrates their essential difference from each other without violating in any way whatsoever the principles of their respective substances. I'd keep reading, but I think that kind of captures it. Which I don't know how many years I've been reading theology, but I never come across this, and now that I've come across it, I was like, well, duh, of course. And this is absolutely central. Until David Go tells me otherwise.
Come, David.
I know. What amazes me this passage is that the soul and body become of a person,
Yeah.
and that of then becomes particular and completely beautiful and unique. Is what demonstrates belonging and appropriates being and everything.
Every particular is the image of God.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Isn't that beautiful?
And that's why everyone is meant to be.
Yeah.
And there is never going to be another person like any other person.
I love that.
Amazing notion.
That
And
beautiful
this
image of
is
the
about-
logi where the logos anticipates when it will come into being.
Mhm.
I mean, you rarely read predestination as beautifully described as that.
Yeah.
But this idea that the logi is there, and the logos sees this proper, not rolling out of, but the fulfillment of the logi in this beautiful way.
I mean, this blows modern individuality right out of the water. It's so shallow. It's nothing compared to what this is. And yet, I wonder, Lorraine, I have a question for you actually, because I know. What do you think of this concept of the individual in terms of as a psychological a modern psychological understanding of the individual, and how this kind of conception of the individual might have something to say to die?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's
That's
essentially
the question. I think that's a great question, and I think there would be a lot of responses. But I think from a modern perspective, it's very hard to. I think there's a very strong reductionist perspective. Like the self is, well, I think specifically more with an even more modern approach. I think there's questions of even the idea of having a self, right? That it could be actually even just this sort of well, there's a push for even this idea of having multiple selves, which I think is kind of a curious point, because historically we would have seen that as actually a pathology, that if you have multiple selves, then that there's something that's gone wrong. But I think there's also a constructivist approach now where we create ourselves, but we end up creating but the idea, I think what Maximus would talk about is that if we create ourselves, then we almost fall in love with ourselves, right? There's this kind of narcissism that comes into it. And I can't remember where it is. Somewhere in here, there's a great quote. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Give me 1 second. I had it highlighted. Well, basically, instead of becoming the image of God, we become the image of ourselves. But, it's on page 123, where he says the aim was that by experiencing pain, we might learn that we have fallen in love with what is not real, and so be taught to redirect our power to what really exists. And I think what struck me about that is how easy it is to fall in love with what's not real about ourselves. But yet, if the some extent of ourselves is what we can create, then we have nothing else to base it on, and so it becomes incredibly shallow, I think, and very much reductionist towards. But Maximus is offering, such as you said, such a beautiful opposite. He's really saying, to be fully ourselves, we have to be in something else, and we have to be in being, for not to use a tautology here, but we have to find ourselves in the eternal rather than the temporary. And I think without that, then the whole psychology of we've moved from the psychology of being to the psychology of self, and now even out of the psychology of self into just selves, the plural. Sorry, I don't know if this is making any sense at all, what I'm trying to say.
Oh, yeah.
Because there is no place to be. If we say that ourselves are just the construction of ourselves, then there's no place for us to be. So we can just be, we have to become this multiplicity. And so instead of multiplicity as Maximus would understand it, it's a fragmented multiplicity, right? It's not the one and the many. It's just the many that supposedly loosely go hand in hand. But how that is exactly, I don't think they've completely worked out. And that's one of my criticisms is always, okay, well, if we have these multiple selves, and how do they work in tandem together? Like, what is the holding principle by which these are held together, so that it doesn't just become, I guess in that sense, multiplicity, but many. Sorry, I don't have the right terminology, but I hope that makes sense what I'm trying to say. So I feel like I've been rambling here for a second, so I'm going to stop now.
But Ahmed, I think that what Maximus gives us more than anything is that, especially with divinization, with theosis, here is that we are made in the image of God and can be called God, at that. But so who is God? Well, we have the Trinity. So we've got 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. Where there is a separateness, but in such a perichoretic relationship that it's hard to understand where the one starts and when the other one ends. And yet they themselves recognize a distinction between them. The Father and the Son are exactly the same, except for to the extent that the Father is the Father and the Son is the Son. Even we see this in who is the creator. For so long, and much you read, it's the Father who is the creator of and yet Colossians says it's Christ. And the two of the Father and the Son working through the Spirit create. So I think that's where we go from individuality to personhood. And that's how we often make that distinction, I guess.
And there's no possibility for communion if you're an individual. And there's only possibility for communion if you're a real person.
Yeah.
And open to receiving what the other has to offer. Yeah. David, you're a tiny bit quiet. Sorry, you're a tiny bit quiet, David.
Well, only to say that image of the Trinity that David has talked about is really it's about the play of communion.
Yeah.
And that also is a revelation about human relationships. It's the play of our communion. And that's where we come to be. So we're not something, but we come to be in the communion. And that's also in Christianity called the body of Christ. So it's curious how these things work.
That principle of gathering too, David, that coming to be within communion. Lorraine, I really like how you developed your images of I forget exactly the language used, but to use Maximus's language, the many, but without a holding principle. I think you said it. without a force of integrity, right? And I think the one in the many works because depending on where the dance is, we see our one Lord, and depending on where the dance is, we see our Lord through it all. If you just have the many, that becomes like you were saying, a false rendering, an illusion of that multiplicity which is blessed, but it's not a multiplicity. It refers back to the one and goes back and forth. It's just fragmented, if I understand you. And if that's where you were getting, I think that's a profound beginning of an analysis of modern dissociation and the kind of frenzy for affirmation, for difference, that we find primarily when people think in terms of identity. But I mean, that's you see that really clearly. I think it's a beautiful thought you have.
This affirmation ex nihilo, it's nihilism. It's a form of nihilism.
Oh yeah. The blind celebration of difference. Yeah. It's nothing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would just add that on the kind of physicalist, natural side of things, the self is, if we're logical, dissolves. And it's one of the reasons over probably a decade, I was gradually drawn into Christian metaphysics, because it seems to me that the idea of the logos becoming flesh, the idea of something that is just beyond a physicalist conception of things, becoming flesh, is the only way we can explain how we as physical beings can exchange meaning, because these are, meaning, the self, personhood, all of these things are non-empirical, non-physicalist concepts. And yet this isn't, I hasten to add, because I'm kind of glossing Maximus, his getting rid of the mind-body duality in a sense, and as David was pointing out, that's what the logos becoming flesh allows. It doesn't have to. I know some Christians, think that it introduces a dualism, but there's another way of reading it. It allows us to get rid of dualisms and explain how the physical can also be more.
Do you think Maximus's way of framing the co-beginning of the body and soul, Michael, do you think it would be intelligible for your intellectual opponents on the scientistic side? Like, what do you think that way of thinking?
I think nihilism, which is inherently unintelligible, is the endpoint of a purely empirical meta basis for inquiry. In other words, if we don't invoke things beyond the empirical, we can't make sense of any concepts. And so physicalism devolves into a kind of nihilism. I was just picking up on Ahmad's point. And a lot of people have sort of bitten the bullet. It's kind of standard in cognitive science that eventually, you just dissolve things like, as Ethan goes back, you end up dissolving things like the person and consciousness and all of this. And it's remarkable that people will, embrace that kind of nihilistic view. And so it's obviously an unintelligible view, but there is no alternative. So yes, it would be unintelligible, but they have to. I would say that, the purely hard-bitten physicalist view is itself so unintelligible, even though it's helping to render the world mechanistically more and more progressively, and yet it's still unintelligible with respect to things that we can't do without: personhood, consciousness, agency, all of these things that are, backdrops, are presuppositions of inquiry, presuppositions of thought, without which, of course, you can't do science. Presuppose ultimately something like the logos, something that somehow beyond our empirical understanding permeates our bodies, our flesh, our organs, the means by which we're communicating with each other with sound waves, etc. Right now.
I see.
Can I make a comment on that? Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
give your comment. Or, okay, just hold it in mind, because I have a question. Jennings, I have you in mind too, and go and Lorraine too. But Michael,
actually, in that case, maybe I should make the comment, because otherwise it's just
Probably.
in direct relation to Michael. Just in regards to, sorry, to that strict empiricism, Michael. I have also concerns about that in another way, is that it by doing that, the individual or the person seeds the spiritual, the full and deep experience of spiritual truth to the empirical. You seed that ground to the empirical. So it's as if one takes, it's like you take whatever burden you might have to take on yourself in searching for spiritual truth, you kind of put them on the back of the empirical machine, and that'll take care of understanding and knowing, and you kind of seed what is your responsibility, your responsibility for spiritual knowledge. I need to articulate this a little bit better, but I think the point you're making is so important. I'll try to return to it with something more intelligible later. Apologies, Andrew. I probably.
Is it a form of irresponsibility then? What you're talking about?
Oh, yes.
Unwillingness to
And
take
cowardice.
responsibility.
It's a form of cowardice, in my opinion. It's a form of cowardice because it's
Strong.
again,
Yeah.
cede your personal responsibility, and
to be a
one walks
person.
away. One walks away from the mystery. To put it in a word, you walk away from the mystery, and that's you essentially give up.
And you walk away from relationship.
Yes.
From being a person. Let me ask one. That's beautiful, Amit. I'm glad that was first. Let me ask Michael, but others too, and Jennings, because of predestination. Maximus is, and this is at the end 139. Back to that. Maximus distinguishing between the principle of origin and the principle of being. He says they are not the same. Now, this is the logos of Genesis and the logos of Ousia. Right? Logos is in these, just to be clear. He says they're not the same. So time and being are not as one necessarily, right? But what interests me is what he says about origin and being. He says origin is the when and the where, along with its reciprocal relation to something else. The latter, the what and the how, along with the basic fact of its existence. It seems to me that the when and the where and the reciprocal relation, that's the structure of our personhood, as it were, time bound in relation with others, and body and soul as an integral whole. That's what's given. That's what's foreknown. That's what pre-exists. The how, right? Or, I mean, sorry, the principle of being, which is, and this is my question, which is of freedom, our freedom. It's the place of our freedom. That's the what and the how. So even if we're foreknown, even if our existence is foreknown, this is the Jennings question for you. Does that mean that its quality is foreknown in this sense, or predestined? Because what it suggests to me is that to speak crudely, the structure is given, but, and then to refer back to the other, if we prepare ourselves to hear the divine voice, then our being responds to the divine being, and so on. But more generally, just, I might be off on that question, but in general, Michael, I'm interested in what you make of this, and others too, the principle of origin and the principle of being. It strikes me as quite an Aristotelian question, and just previously, Maximus had relied heavily on an Aristotelian category of reciprocal relation to point to how the body is understood to be with the soul. So he's dancing with philosophy here as well. He's giving a Christian account of the birth of the person. but he's dancing with philosophy here too. And that's, I would just wondered how that echoed in your mind.
I'll quickly sort of hand the ball to David, since I'd like to hear his responses. But it seems to me to be borderline, I'll be as provocative as I can, kind of borderline blasphemous in any way to try to contain the infinite mystery of the Logos, even as it becomes flesh in us. And so I like the distinction you make there. There might be a structural narrative and so forth that is preordained, but nonetheless, there's aspects of what comes into being through the Logos that can't be contained, and so can't be put into a deterministic framework. Oh, that's it.
That's beautiful. That's fair enough.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's so much to say about predestination. I think I'd like to go with some basic principles. One is that the will of God will not be thwarted by man. And we are told what the will of God is. Reconciliation of all things unto himself, the recapitulation of all to Jesus Christ. So whatever happens, the will of God will not be thwarted. How on earth do we have free will, if you want to call it that, and yet God achieves what he wishes to achieve? Well, you know, if God's outside of time and space, what we think of as predestination of a, you know, he knows that tomorrow I will do this, is a very time-bound understanding. God's not so limited. And so being able to see all, know all, we might call that predestination, but, you know, if you've watched a movie 4 or 5 times, like The Godfather or something, I mean, you can still enjoy the movie and still know how it's going to end. So there's an element of that. I think that what's really important is that it not be a determinism, I think, or from a spiritual point of view, it's important that a determinism doesn't sort of get me off the hook, that I don't have a choice. You know, Maximus emphasized this time and time again. We are to, you know, the life of contemplation and the life of the virtues, the pursuit of the virtues, the end of which is Jesus Christ. And we have choices. And he talked a little bit about this with the 2 phrases where the being dragged down and being bound by the chains on the earth, of the one where, you know, you're distracted from what you should be focusing on. That's one thing. The other is seeking the pleasures of the body. Either one, though, are choices. And whatever predestination means, it can't mean that those aren't choices, because time and time again in the New Testament, whether it's the rich young ruler or otherwise, you are given a choice and you make choices. But whatever your choices are, did not mean that outside of time and space, God cannot see that his will's fulfilled. So I'm trying to keep it as quick and
No, and I that's very nicely and succinctly put. What just to push a little bit further, outside of, like you're saying, outside of mortal conditions, time and space, to speak of God knowing beyond time, fair enough. If that's what predestination means or is understood to mean, that doesn't seem. But what I'm interested in is what the conclusion does for humanity, what it does to us. Just like I'm interested in what a universalist position, I'm not sure if they're the same or not, but that concludes about humanity, does to how we treat each other in time, in the moment, in relation. In so I think, I mean, everything you said seems sane and sound indeed. How does it change? Does it change our vision of other people, though? I mean, you partly answer that by the stressing it is a choice and we can't understand it as but a choice. That opens us up to hospitality and forgiveness and you know, and so on. Pardon me.
I think that predestination, when we read about it, I mean, Ephesians, what he's quoting from here, is important to read the whole sentence. And that what are we predestined for? We're predestined for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ. So it's not a predestination that I will end up, doing well on my test, or not being able to drive, or fill in the blank. I mean, it doesn't really matter. The predestination is adoption and all the theology around adoption. And I think that as his children, and so if one looks to predestination theologically, I think it can't be that this transactional understanding of whether or not I'm in heaven or in hell. I do think that we are told that we are predestined by him, and it takes a ton of the weight of being bound by the law and good works, forcing you to do something. We've been predestined by him as adoption as his children to do good works. So if you start from that position of being predestined, I'm already in the club. I'm the older brother.
You're logoi.
I'm logoi. Exactly. I'm the older brother with the prodigal son who's sitting there bitching to his dad that, why are you spending your money on there, when the older brother was also given his half of the inheritance when the younger brother got it. And yet we aren't living in that reality. Predestination, I think, ought to create that sense that we are living in the right reality, that we are already adopted, that we are already logoi, that we are already within the Godhead. We're told this by Paul. When Christ died, we died. When he rose, we rose, and he sits at the right hand of God the Father. We are sitting at the right hand of God the Father, and predestination theologically ought to be that that's where we get to. I'm not saying that's where we are.
It's not about being, it's about knowing.
Yeah, that's it.
Your being is.
Bingo.
I was going to ask if it was an existential
The
concept.
challenge is our knowing and our willing what we know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And by the way, I mean, just that originally, when Calvin was writing about predestination, he wrote it as a gift of assurance to his parishioners. And of course, everyone took it and ran exactly the wrong way with it. So, and you see in his various editions of the Institutes of Christian Studies that predestination keeps getting pushed further and further to the back, and it goes from this size to this size in the writing, because he sees the practical implications of a people who then worry, well, if it's predestined, then there's nothing that can save me. I'm tied up in hell. This double predestination thing. But
David Jennings.
Yeah.
Sorry. I thought you were going to stop for a second, but this idea you said for Calvin, that at the beginning it was an assurance. By that, do you mean that it was grounded in a hopefulness, like this? Okay, because when I first started, reading up and started to engage with Christianity, the concept of predestination was really problematic for me, because there was something about it, not only that it was deterministic, but that there was a sense of fatalism and hopelessness in it.
Yeah.
And then I remember I've spoken with Andrew about this. I remember listening to Monteverdi's Vespers, and in the very first piece of the Vespers, there's this line in Latin which translates into, and it's a line from the scriptures: "As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end." And I remember listening to that and reading that and thinking, so that's the fullness of predestination. It's the fullness. It's hopefulness. It's for everlasting, for now and ever and before. So it's the flip side of predestination. So yeah, I take what you say. It gives predestination.
I just called it up. Ephesians 1:4-5. He chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless before him in love. He predestined us for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of his will. Now, how we in our fallenness take that, twist it to being a deterministic, someone's going to hell, and but if you just sit back and read what's actually said there, you can see why it's a gift of assurance.
You know what it is, David? It's the turning of a phrase into a term, and a rendering of that term a theological title. It's an abstraction from life.
And a promise of relationship to how does that fit within a legal strata?
Yeah. What strikes me about everything you're saying, David, is how ordinary it is. How unremarkable it is. I mean, no, it's remarkable, of a complete joy, and of a fullness which is beyond comprehension. But it's not a new or daring or different idea, but it sounds like it is. And that movement from having something be a part of the rhythm of life to naming it and having it stand out and making, I think that's close to what Lorraine is talking about, where we can forget part of the breath, that this is part of our breath, and we begin to think, oh, it's an idea. Well, I could live by this idea. Yeah, no, that was really nice how you put that. And yeah, Ahmed, I'm right with you. You spoke for me. Yeah, coming through that turn too. Yeah.
But the greatest predestination of all, I really want to emphasize, is it's not us, it's about God. And God has already said, all things will be reconciled through me. The recapitulation of all things in Jesus Christ. That's predestined. And if we take that as what predestination means, doesn't it just take the pressure off, and actually the relationship we have with God is not suspicious. It's not out of fear, in that sort of corrosive type of fear, but it's out of love. And wow.
Yeah, but I think one has to step into God to begin to, for it to begin to not be hopeless. You got to step into God first, which is the rub. I think for many, it's that first step into God is.
It was amazing. It was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. That's it's stepping into that, being exposed to it, and it's not all going to be puppies and roses. I mean, I think George MacDonald describes it quite well. I mean, we're going to be going through a hellish fire, but it's of a purification, so that we can feel present before Christ and welcomed. That doesn't mean
river of fire. Daniel's river of fire does that job, but in a nicer way.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Let's pause for today. Pardon me.